Welcome to Sino-Warfare with Ralph D. Sawyer.
Although Sunzi was the first to discuss strategic power, Sunzi believed the concept originated in antiquity. He says, Emperor Yi created bows and crossbows, and he conceived strategic power from them. How do we know that bows and crossbows constitute the basis for strategic power? Released from between the shoulders, they kill a man beyond 100 paces without him ever realizing the arrow's path. Thus it's said that bows and crossbows are the essence of strategic power. Now Sunzi's conviction thus well coheres with Sunzi's crossbow analogy, which we previously witnessed. The concept of strategic power is little changed in the military methods. Sure still refers to all of the Army's aspects and elements, together with any advantages derived from position, though the latter are somewhat less prominent in the theoretical discussions. However, there's a subtle reorientation in the relationship between strategic power and the Army soldiers. Sunzi made human initiative irrelevant when he said, "One who excels at warfare seeks victory through the strategic configuration of power, not from reliance on men." And he basically reduced their participation to the passive status of logs being rolled along by the commanding general. At first glance, Sunzi seemingly concurs with his ancestor, for he asserts, strategic power is the means by which to cause the soldiers to invariably fight. However, he's much more sensitive to the question of individual motivation and the need for fervent commitment. Many factors affect the Army's chi, or morale, among them confidence in the strength or superiority of their forces, which in turn makes them powerful. Wresting victory with the disaffected soldiers in the warring state spirit would have been impossible. Although everyone agreed that rewards and punishments are the chief means of control, Sunzi felt that even they might fail if the soldiers are overtaxed. He says, if rewards haven't been awarded, nor punishments yet employed, but the troops obey their commands, it's because they're able to implement them. If the rewards are large and punishments pervasive, but the people don't obey their commands, it's because they're unable to implement them. To make people advance unto death in spite of disadvantageous circumstances, without turning on their heels, is like trying to make water flow contrary to normal. Now, continuing the water analogy, he concluded, someone who understands the patterns of flowing water can float rocks and break boats. When he understands the people's nature and employs them, they will implement his commands, just like water flowing. Certain measures, other than manipulating their chi, a subject we'll discuss shortly, can be undertaken to fully realize the Army's strategic power.
To realize strategic power in warfare, don't sever large formations, nor break up small ones. The rear shouldn't encroach upon the front shouldn't trample the rear. Those who are advancing should have a route out. Those who are withdrawing should have a route for advancing. Increase the victorious, change the defeated, rest the weary, and feed the hungry. Then the soldiers will see the enemy's men, but not perceive death, tread on naked blades, and not turn their heels.
Just as in the art of war, strategic power and the unorthodox and orthodox are intertwined. As we previously discussed in Sunzi 6, unorthodox warfare, the mutually defining concepts of the unorthodox and orthodox, qi and zheng, almost certainly originated with Sunzi. Common strategies and expected tactics are orthodox. Those that contravene general rules and normal expectation, that are flexible and entail the element of surprise, are unorthodox. While they are the focus of a dedicated chapter in the military methods, the principles are also discernible in the tactics proposed for defeating various formations, segmenting the troops, creating reserve and unorthodox components, mounting flank and encircling attacks, manipulating the enemy, structuring the battlefield, and exploiting unexpected measures. Sunzi prefaces exposition by raising the seasonal and other analogies employed in the art of war to categorize the cyclical nature of qi and zheng. But then he ventures into a more esoteric realm by linking qi and zheng with the formless, a concept originally espoused by Sunzi, in a kind of new comprehensive formulation that transcends the original. It perhaps owes much to the famous Taoist contemplative work known as the Tao Te Ching, for which you may consult my Marshall translation, which appeared under the title The Tao of War. The discussion of the unorthodox in the military methods is undoubtedly the most incisive of any of China's numerous military manuals. Although we will examine it here, I suggest you give the full text a very careful reading, and perhaps look into my book on the subject, The Tao of Deception. I would also tackle the topic again in a couple of dedicated talks if interest prompts. Now the crux begins with the contemplation of form.
Having that which is surplus, having that which is insufficient. These are form and strategic power. There aren't any disciples of form that it cannot be named, nor any named disciples that cannot be conquered. The sage conquers the myriad things with the myriad things. Therefore his conquering is never impoverished.
The basic principle is simply that in warfare, things with form conquer each other. In other words, if it's tangible, you can characterize it and plan accordingly. However, rather than plunging headlong into battle and directly opposing force with force, unorthodox measures should be employed.
Once they are differentiated, things take form. Once forms have been determined, they have names. When form is employed to respond to form, it's orthodox. When the formless controls the formed, it's unorthodox. Because things that are the same can't conquer each other, employ the different to create the unorthodox. Accordingly, take quietness to be the unorthodox for movement, ease to be the unorthodox for weariness, satiety to be the unorthodox for hunger, order to be the unorthodox for chaos, and the numerous to be the unorthodox for the few. When action is initiated, it becomes the orthodox. What has not yet been initiated is the unorthodox. When the unorthodox is initiated and not responded to, it will be victorious.
Examples of complementary dispositions are found throughout the military methods, several being proposed for desperate situations. Clearly, Sun Bin was confident that the judicious employment of unorthodox measures could always wrest victory, because he said, there aren't any forms that cannot be conquered. Then he added, none know the form by which the general conquers. Moreover, as he states more than once, the changes in the forms of conquest are coterminal with heaven and earth and are inexhaustible. However, even though the possibilities may be inexhaustible, victory in warfare is governed by singularity.
Those that have form all conquer in accord with their mode of victory. Employing one form of conquest to conquer the myriad forms is not possible. That by which one controls the form is singular, that by which one conquers cannot be singular.
The singular, of course, refers to the formless exploitation of the unorthodox. However, the actual techniques are multiple because they depend on the many elements in any given battlefield situation. Nevertheless, the issue of comparative strength, which we'll consider in our next talk, is inescapable, as is the topography's influence. And when it comes to configurations of terrain, Sun Bin concurred with Sunzi's belief that topography inescapably constrains the tactical possibilities. Many art of war categories draw attention, including the previously identified Heaven's Well, Heaven's Jail, Heaven's Net, Heaven's Fissure, and Heaven's Pit. Sun Bin terms them killing grounds, and he admonishes commanders not to occupy or remain on them. Well, perhaps because clashes had become more frequent in the wetter, southern portion of the country, Sun Bin particularly warns commanders about entrapping terrains, which he characterizes as conducive to defeat, no doubt because the spongy ground would impede maneuvering and make armies deployed on them very vulnerable. The list includes gorges with streams, valleys, river areas, marshes, wetlands, and salt flats. Aquatic warfare, in fact, draws attention in 10 deployments, which also includes a brief discussion of its counterpart, incendiary warfare. He offers some rather simplistic comments on rivers and their dynamics, such as the need to avoid going contrary to the current's flow or being caught while fording rivers. The viability of flowing water is also characterized. Water that flows to the east is life-sustaining. Water that flows to the north is deadly. Water that doesn't flow is death. Being employed to classify mountains and terrain, yin and yang, entail important implications.
In the Tao of terrain, yang constitutes the exterior, yin constitutes the interior. The direct constitutes the warp, techniques constitute the woof. Deployments will not be confused when the woof and the warp have been realized. The direct traverses land where the vegetation thrives. Techniques take advantage of where the foliage is half dead.
Sunzi also implies a highly unusual characterization based upon the 5 elements of earth, water, fire, wood, and metal to the soil, terrain, and mountains. The phase dynamics inherent to these 5 elements characterize these relationships, presumably because, for example, greater heights have an advantage over lesser, and greater density over diffuseness. Commanders should always avoid terrain that cannot sustain life, including incinerated areas. More important, the commanding general must thoroughly investigate the terrain in accord with its characteristics in order to successfully maneuver his troops and defeat the enemy. Once one being was asked, "What causes trouble for the army? What causes difficult for the enemy?" he replied, "Terrain causes trouble for the army. Ravines cause difficulty for the enemy. 3 li of wetlands will cause trouble for the army. Crossing through them will result in leaving the main force behind. Thus it said, terrain causes trouble for the army. Ravines cause trouble for the enemy." The military methods describes 5 situations in which advancing to engage the enemy is tactically inadvisable. Crossing rivers, confronting hills, going contrary to the current's flow, occupying killing ground, and confronting masses of trees. In these 5, you will not be victorious. Enemies should be targeted on deadly ground after being compelled to enter it, while easy terrain should only be exploited when the commander enjoys a decisive superiority in numbers or mobility. Conversely, constricted terrain, which is generally avoided, should be exploited to vanquish the enemy by concealing troops in ambush and taking advantage of the heights, just as at Ma Ling. Ravines can also be converted into impregnable strongholds simply by erecting fortifications across the mouth. Next time we'll discuss the problems associated with command and control. I hope you'll join us.
Thank you for being with us.